our plan is to only take about, I think Laurie and I plan to do about 40 minutes, and we're hoping that we're really clear, and so that we'll just be able to take exciting questions. But if we're not quite as clear as we think we're going to be, we're also hoping that you'll just ask questions, and in the end, everybody will go home saying, yes, that was not bad. So what we do want to talk about today are the data availability requirements, how to satisfy them, and how to be really successful with doing that satisfying. And so there are two main requirements that JFSP has set up. The first one comes in at project closing, where they had a long time requirement of submitting a final report. To that requirement, they're adding a need to submit metadata describing the data that were generated by the research project. And then the second requirement is 6 months after project closing, they'd like to have the metadata and data submitted to a public repository for data. And then as a consequence of that submission, provide updated metadata to the Forest Service Research Data Archive, so that that metadata can be used in the JFSP data catalog, which helps people say, oh, what has JFSP done? Where can I find the products that their research has produced? And there's a number of reasons. I mean, one of the things that we do want to be really clear about is that the whole data availability requirement is not just yet another administrative checkoff sort of thing. It is very much designed to be a scientific value add for JFSP and its participating scientists. So JFSP itself has a few purposes for the requirement. One of them being promoting reproducibility of research analysis results from JFSP-funded science. As many of you are probably aware, reproducibility of research results has been a demonstrated problem across a wide number of scientific areas, disciplines, and this is generally considered to be one of the better ways of approaching it, and at least, and not preventing it, but helping to facilitate answering issues when they happen to come up. Is that there are the data, you can go in and work with them. So that's sort of a short-term objective. Longer term is JFSP would like to maximize the value of the taxpayer investment in its research, and can do that by promoting long-term reuse of research data that it funds the collection of. Those are things that have been with the JFSP data program since its inception in 2011. And then in 2013, there's been a federal public access mandate was put in place. That is just being put in implementation actually just about now and for the next few years, as organizations like Department of Interior, National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health get these requirements instituted in their grant systems, which is to make digital scientific data as well as the scholarly articles that come out of federally funded research, to make those things publicly accessible and preserved over the long term. So those first three are things that are sort of aimed around JFSP's objectives pretty much. And then one of the other things we know, because people have been doing data availability for a while and they've been doing it long enough, that we can actually say from a number of disciplines that journal articles whose supporting data are publicly available actually have higher citation rates than journal articles whose supporting data are not publicly available. And so this particular purpose is sort of a joint between Joint Fire Science Program and you, the research community, of you like to have high citation rates, and JFSP likes to have high citation rates as well, because that demonstrates the utility of their research and hopefully convinces Congress to provide continuing funding. And then, as perhaps some of you have noticed, an increasing number of journals are requiring that as a condition of publishing a research article, that the underlying research data need to be available in a public repository. And these are very many high-profile journals. The PLOS journals have been doing it for quite a while. Science is now doing it, and there are quite a few others in a number of different fields that are saying, yes, public access to research data is really important. And so they're having that requirement. Okay, so let's come back actually to the JFSP requirements. 2 milestones. End of project closing, submit your metadata to JFSP. What do you need to do? Obviously, what you need to do is write your metadata. And the thing that Laurie and I have learned is that everybody severely underestimates the amount of time it takes to write metadata. So we want to strongly emphasize writing metadata takes time, start it early. It is as bad as, well, it's not as bad as writing a journal article, but it's close. Because essentially metadata is a lightweight version of the introduction of a research article, and it's like a expanded version of the methods part of a research article. And so there can be quite a bit of writing involved and a lot of information to organize to get the metadata done. There are lots of resources available to help you with this process, because we do understand that for many of you, writing metadata is not something that is a common activity. We do have Windows software available. Most people who have used it, and it is in use around the world. Most people seem to like it. Laurie's also put together a Microsoft Word form that I believe we have an agreement from JFSP that would be satisfactory for this project closing report. And if you happen to be working with geospatial data in something like Esri's ArcGIS, certainly the Arc catalog capability can help you write metadata. Once you've got it, whether it be the XML, the extensible markup language that Metavist writes and is widely used by data repositories, or the Microsoft Word form, send the metadata file to JFSP with your final report. If you have questions about Metavist, if you have questions about the metadata standard, contact me, contact Laurie. I actually wrote Metavist, so there shouldn't be any problems that come up that I haven't seen before. If you have questions about submitting the metadata, talk to Molly. And then in some respects, the harder milestone, submitting the data. So abstractly, there are 2 ways to do this, which is why there's milestone A, and then next slide I'll talk about milestone 2B. Broadly speaking, you need to get your data into a repository. What repository? Your data management plan probably specified one that you were planning to use when the research started or when you made your proposal. If that's still a good one, submit the conforming package to the repository. And then because having that package be available in the repository will trigger some changes to the metadata, you'll need to update the metadata that JFSP has as you need, what repository you're using, what URL your data are available at, any other changes on either data quality, processing steps, etc., from the metadata that were provided for the project closeout. And once you've finished updating your metadata, send that to either me or to Laurie, because we will want to put that final metadata document in the JFSP data catalog that we operate as part of the Forest Service Research Data Archive. The 2B part is, okay, let's say that your repository is the Forest Service Research Data Archive. And then we can be, Laurie and I are a little more knowledgeable about how our archive works. So for us, you're actually prepping the data, the full metadata, and any supporting information that you want to provide users. Supporting information for us can be video, photographs, technician manuals, anything that you want to provide a data user to help ensure that that person can be as successful as possible in reusing your data. So that package is submitted to us if you're going to use this as your repository. If it's the final version of your data supporting one or more research articles, we will review it with you, and once we're happy and you're happy, we will publish it and provide a digital object identifier. These are the same digital object identifiers or DOIs that you will see in most of your research articles these days. If it's not the final version, if you're not quite ready to make it fully publicly available yet because your articles haven't been accepted yet, for example, we will review with you, make sure it's all ready to go, and then put it in a dark archive, which is not publicly accessible. And we will then flip the switch on making it publicly accessible when your articles have been accepted or after 3 years, whichever comes first. And that pretty much closes out the part that I have. We have a sponsored message because, well, that's the age we live in. This one is from the Forest Service Research Data Archive, surprisingly enough. And so this is their home page with the Joint Fire Science Program prominently displayed on the home page. The Research Data Archive publishes 3 types of data sets. Static data sets, which would have the metadata, a file index indicating all the files that are in the package, so you can verify that, yes, everything showed up where it was supposed to be. And this comes in as downloadable zip files. We also do handle dynamic data. So of course, you always have metadata, and you still have the supplemental information. In the catalog, we provide, however, instead of a downloadable zip file, we provide a link to a database with a query interface that lets you grab whatever subset of the data is actually of interest. That's particularly handy if the data set is frequently updated because new data are coming in, or if the data set is particularly large and you don't want to do a static download of a terabyte, you can instead grab 5 gigs out of what you need out of the big database. We certainly are set up to have links to external repositories. Certainly a number of JFSP funded projects. We have metadata in our catalog that points to, for example, tree ring repositories. We have some that point to NOAA repositories. And so what we provide on the product page is the metadata and a link to that external archive, pointing as much as we can actually to the data publication itself. And this actually is one of our data pub web pages. Standard sort of information, titles, authors, citations, abstract, and then down at the bottom there where it says data product, you can actually look at the metadata, look at the file index of what things will you be getting, and then download the actual package. As a note, people do read these metadata before they do the download of the data package. We track all of our stuff with Google Analytics, and generally for every data product download, we have about 0.8 views of metadata. So most folks are doing it. And that's part of you do a search, I find stuff that's interesting, now I need to dig a little bit deeper. How were those data collected? What were the quality parameters used for that project? Is it really going to be worth my while to download them? So if you like to make sure that your data is going to be seen, if you're using us as your repository, we do have global reach. Last count, about 99 countries. Every state in the United States has come to visit with us. And our audience is spanning all kinds of sectors: researchers, students, businesses, private citizens, members of other branches of government. just about everybody. We currently have somewhat over 230 data publications with over 1,000 downloads in the first quarter of this year, and actually today I can tell you we had another 1,000 plus in the second quarter of the year. So we're doing fairly well there. And the gold standard of our science, we are actually seeing citations in the scientific literature of our data publications. And the 80% data pubs downloaded at least once. So of the 230, things I like to tell my leadership is that people come in for the full breadth of what we have in the catalog. The other thing I will also I've often mentioned to my leadership is that these downloads aren't of just data sets that were published in the last year or three. We go back to 2003 in our catalog, and people continue every year to grab some of our earliest published data sets. So they do have lasting value. And then if you are thinking about, what was my point in putting this on there? We do have multiple second and third editions. So we do have a versioning system. Versioning system was put in part so if you find errors or if users find errors, we can put out new editions of the data. But it's also more commonly used actually when people decide that they're going to put out part of the data set, publish a new paper, and they want to integrate some information from the new paper into that original data set because they're closely linked, but you don't want to let all the data outright until you've actually got the articles for that all put together. So a lot of times our second and third editions will have no data corrections. They'll just add additional years of data or add some additional variables. And I think part of the point of adding that, let me check and yes, I'm at that slide. So part of the point again is to reemphasize this point that we walk through all this stuff in order to add value to the science that JFSP funds and therefore the work that you all are doing. And so we are looking at these just like journal articles in the sense that you can go back to a library and get a journal article from the 1700s. 100 years from now, you should be able to, not you, you won't come back, but future scientists should be able to come in and find these data and be able to reuse them and repurpose them in new and interesting ways. And that's the end of our commercial and time for me to turn this over to Laurie Porth.
Thanks, Dave. I saw one question pop up in the window, what's the data archive URL? So I went ahead and typed it in, but something you can find us easily on Google. Just put in the words data archive and then make sure you either add research or Forest Service to that. And most of the time we pop right up at the top. So it's pretty easy to find us. And so it looks like I have be able to change slides. That's great. So I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit today about tips for success, how to write useful metadata, what goes into a data publication, and how to go about submitting data to our archive. So writing quality metadata, what goes into it? Well, the first part of that really is understanding the purpose behind metadata. And so the first and most obvious purpose is really to help you understand your data. We're all working on a lot of different projects. And a lot of times with a study, you've got a study plan, you maybe have lab notes, you maybe have a report where you have some information in there. Your technician or your student may have other information about the study as well. So really, writing the metadata document allows you to put all of your knowledge about that study in one place. And if you're like me, I may remember what I'm doing today, tomorrow, and next week, but 2 months from now, I'm going to have a hard time remembering and I might have to go look stuff up. So really, it's a great way to help you out in the future as well. The other purpose is that it's a great way to help others understand your data, and that's really, I guess, one of our main purposes because we're making this data available to others. But obviously that will help people today who are downloading it, but it will also help people 20 years from now still use this data because we're all going to move on and retire at some point, and we may still be reachable in the future to ask questions about your study, but hopefully we'll all be on the beach somewhere relaxing or in the field. as opposed to sitting around waiting for someone to call and ask questions about our data. So that's one thing that's very helpful. It's also great marketing for your data. As you looked at those stats from Dave, you can see we have a lot of people coming into our archive and looking at the metadata and the data, and most people are looking at that metadata to determine whether or not they want to download it. So if you've got your metadata in there and it's complete and users can tell why you collected it and how they could maybe use it to determine whether or not it applies to what they're interested in, that can really help you as well. It's also a guide to other documentation in a pub. So we realize that sometimes methods can be very simple for data collection and sometimes they're very complex. Some people have 20 or 30 pages of methods written out or information about the accuracy of the measurements and some reports. So in cases like that, we don't necessarily need to grab all of that text and throw it into the metadata. What we instead could do is provide some general information in the metadata document and then point users to that file that would still be included in the data download package. One of the main things that we're thinking about when we write this metadata, we want to try to have as much information in that one document as possible while still being realistic. So that's one of the reasons why we're willing to point some of those other pubs. The other thing to think about, though, is that we do need enough information that the user understands what they're looking for and if that data applies to them. We don't want to have to force them to download and click on a bunch of other links to determine whether or not this data will work for them. We also have a lot of people harvesting our metadata as well. So those users really only have access to the metadata and then will choose to download it by clicking on a link within that document. So for instance, if you've got this 20 or 30 page methods document, we still want to have a paragraph or two that gives general information about how your data were collected. You know, why did you collect at the particular site that you chose? How did you pick the plots? What variables were measured and how were they measured? So within reason, we need at least some information within that metadata document, and then we can point to some of those other reports or documents within the zip file. So what are some characteristics of writing great metadata? The first, obviously, is correct. We prefer that it be correct, and that's everybody's goal. However, we're not perfect, and so we know there's always going to be problems. If you're submitting data to us, in metadata, it's not difficult for us to make those updates. So that's one good thing for you to know. We can pretty easily, with a couple small changes, correct metadata and upload that. But obviously, it's more ideal to have metadata that's complete and correct at the beginning of the process. Other things that make great metadata and things that we're looking for are completeness. Have you addressed all of the elements that are in the metadata? If there are some optional elements that apply to you, have you filled those out? One of the biggest problems that we have right now, we have a pretty small staff and we have a lot of data coming through us. And most people are not filling out all the metadata. So that takes us a lot more time to go through and interact. And one of the things, just as a tip for you, if you guys can submit quality metadata to us that's complete and has all the information that we need, our turnaround time is a lot faster. We can usually do things in an hour or two if it's a pretty normal data package submission. But if we're getting metadata that's not very complete, but you've sent us some documents, we may try to fill some of that out for you, but it's harder for us to understand what's missing as well. So it can take a lot of time. So we definitely prefer that you have complete metadata at the beginning, if possible. We also want metadata to be comprehensive. We want to make sure that it is fully describing the data. We want to make sure that you have literally gone through and told us what all of the variables are, what their units are, how they were collected, and as I mentioned earlier, how did you select the study site? How did you select the plots where you measured the data? All that information needs to be in there, and the quality of the data. It's very important to the user to know how accurate these measurements are. So all of that information would be helpful and comprehensible. One of the things, a lot of times we're writing metadata, our own documentation for our needs, but we have a lot of people that are accessing this archive that aren't experts. And you could see from Dave's slide earlier, we have students. We actually have some elementary students that are accessing our data. We also have scientists. We have a wide breadth of people that are accessing this documentation. So within reason, we do prefer that it be understandable by those non-experts. So what goes into a data publication? a simple example would be maybe one data set with some variables, a metadata document, and then supplemental information. Supplemental information could be anything from a study plan or an internal report. It could be a map of your area. It could be images, photographs that were taken of your site or of the devices used to measure your data. So that in its simplest form would be a particular data publication. But we also have very wide breadth all the way up to something that's very complex, where it could be hundreds or thousands of data sets with many variables. You may have different file types. You can have Excel, you can have GIS files. In cases like that, we may have to make some modifications, and we may need to do something such as have a metadata document for each section. Let me give you an example, an experimental forest. We typically will archive experimental forest data by type. So we would maybe have streamflow data as a package and meteorological data. But there may be reasons, and we have one experimental forest right now, where we actually have all of that data archived together in one package. So those things make sense to put together and reference and cite and use all together. However, the documentation for them may be very different. So the methods used to obtain meteorological data is very different from the methods used to collect precipitation data or tree measurements in the field. So in a case like that, we may have a different metadata document for each type of data, but then we would still have one overall metadata document that would appear on the data page that would allow users to just in one place read about the data that would be included, and then that document would point to the other individual metadata documents for more details. And then, of course, we would include supplemental information as well. So we have all different types of data submissions. It really is a broad range. One of the most common questions that we get is, how do I package my data? How do I determine what should be a data publication? And that's something that we can work with you with. There really is no right or wrong answer. Things that we ask you to think about are, how are people going to use these data, and are they always going to want the entire package? If someone coming in, are they going to want part A, B, and C of what you're trying to figure out how to break up? And if they are, then we should probably package those together. But if someone's coming in and they may only want part B, then maybe we should archive that as a separate package. Other things to consider are the methods. Is that the methods and how that data were collected, or the metadata document in general, can that all be described very simply for all parts A, B, and C in one file? And if they can, then we should package it. If they can't, then maybe we should separate them out. So again, there's no right or wrong answer. We kind of work with you on how that works best. As far as file sizes, we also deal with a very broad range of that as well. And we can also have multiple zip files. So even if you have a fairly large package and you want it all zipped up together, we can still provide multiple downloads for people. So that doesn't mean you have to split them up if you don't want to. We can just make it available in different parts. Here's some information, citation on an article. Dave is actually one of the authors on this article, and this is a great article. It talks to you about basically how to set up a data management for long-term studies, and it actually would apply to short-term studies as well. So those of you who are just starting out on a big project, I would highly recommend that you read this. It's a great start. It'll step you through the process. It'll help you think about things that you maybe wouldn't have thought of. Who should be responsible for this part of the project? What are the components of data management? How do you plan and prepare for this? How do you go about writing the metadata? Gives you some basic information about the implementation lifecycle. Where do you start? What are the different parts of the process? So I would highly recommend that for those of you that are just starting this process. So how do you go about submitting data to the Forest Service Research Data Archive? If you are on our website, over on the left-hand side, you see there's a red arrow. That first button that you were to click on takes you to the data catalog, which provides you access to our data and allows you to search for data. The second one is the Submitting Metadata button. So you can take a look at that anytime you want for more details. But basically, the process involves you contacting us and letting us know that you have some data to submit. And then once we've done that, then you're going to send us your data or data sets. You're going to send us your draft metadata document. You can send us any additional files that you have, those supplemental things that we talked about, research notes, study plans, images, etc. If you have a publication or a link to your publication, it's great for you to include that as well, because sometimes we might have some minor questions that we can maybe answer on our own by taking a quick look at your publication. And then, of course, we're going to want to reference that publication as well. within the metadata document. And then we need a submission form. This form basically just lists some basic information about your submission, and then it requires the author's signature to let us know that the data have undergone sufficient QA/QC and that you think it's ready for the public. That being said, there are some times where we have to archive data that maybe haven't been through the full QA/QC process, but as long as the metadata document talks about that and lets people know what the format of that data are, that's okay. If you're a Forest Service author, then we will need a supervisor's signature as well on that submission form. And so that's why there's two different forms for Forest Service author and not. That's the only difference. So basically you're going to submit that package to us. You can send us your data in virtually any format. We may work with you to modify that format because we obviously want things to be in a format that will be available in the future. We prefer to not require people to have certain software package to view a file. We also want that data to be available in 50 years. So we need to think about some of those things. But we don't want you at this point, at least in the first part of the process, to have to worry about converting your data. So you can send it to us in almost any format, and we'll work with it with you. And basically then what we do is we will review that data and the metadata, make sure that they match, make sure that everything is complete, and then we will send you a review form back that will have some questions for you, allow you to make some modifications to the metadata. And then once we have worked together and we've come to a point where we think that the metadata and the data are ready to go, we will package that together. We will assign a digital object identifier, as Dave mentioned, and then we will push that through to production. For more information, you can access our website, as we mentioned above. We have a couple of different materials that we can send. We're actually going to put those on our website this week. Right now, we just have them internally and just send them to folks when they ask us questions and let us know they're going to submit data to us. But we're going to put some of that documentation on there just so you can directly download it as well. But we also have archive staff as well who are here to answer questions for you. Here's our list of our staff. It's Dave and myself, and then we have a research intern, Erica. And then throughout the summer and sometimes during the school year, we have a couple students that are working for us on certain projects and are also available to help us with some of those initial reviews and interactions with folks. So we have a question for you now. We would like to know how we can help you guys write metadata. So we're going to put some more documentation on the web, but we're curious if people are interested in a metadata-specific webinar. So if there is a need, we can put together a webinar. We can spend 40, 45 minutes with you guys and literally step through every part of the metadata standard and let you know what goes in it, show you some examples. We also have the ability to add more documentation, even more than what we mentioned earlier. So what we're going to do, we're going to try to do this little poll over here on the left, this feedback. I think you guys can see it over on the left-hand side just below the list of attendees. So if you're interested in the webinar or think that's something that would be useful to you, click A. For documentation, do B. Some people don't want to do webinars. They prefer just documentation available to them. We can do that. C for both. And then I recognize some names, so it looks like some people maybe already do know how to write metadata, but we have no idea what level of knowledge you guys have. So if you guys have already written metadata and feel very comfortable with it and you think you are ready to go, that is awesome, and so then you can just mark D. So if you guys have a few minutes now, go ahead and click that and let us know. And then based on your responses, we would maybe put together a webinar or put some more documentation out there for you. And then if you have other other suggestions, we are always open to other suggestions, then go ahead and just put them in the chat window on the left-hand side, and we will go through and we will respond to you and let you know if that's something that we can do for you as well. So I'll give everyone a second to do that.
We got about 9 people out there who haven't answered, so just chime in a quick answer and then we'll share the results. So hopefully, I'm not sure if I was able to share that effectively, but we've got about 10 people, about half of the people say that both webinar and written stuff is useful, and then about 40% say the written material, and a couple of people, just 10%, say that they're already writing metadata and don't need the additional help.
Great. Thank you so much, Xander. Well, that really helps. So it looks like there maybe is a need to put together a webinar. And what I would recommend, we'll go ahead and do that, and we'll let Molly know so that they can get that information out to you guys. But I would highly recommend that you maybe spend at least a few minutes trying to jump into metadata and writing your own. Because if you've kind of already started the process and then you jump into our webinar, you'll be able to ask questions much easier, actually, which probably help you go further if you've kind of started the process on your own. But we will definitely do that, and we will work on some documentation and probably put that out on our website. But we'll also let Molly know so that she can pass that information along to you guys. And that concludes the end of our portion of it. And so now I think we can just open it up to questions.
Let's go ahead. There have been some good questions in the chat window, and maybe we'll start with those. We have about 30 people on the line, so it might get a little noisy if we open up the audio. But so we'll start with the typed-in questions, and maybe I'll address one quickly that I can, and that is about the recording. Chris Bowman asked about if it will be available online, and yes, we can make recording a sort of video with the slides and the audio available, and I'll work with the presenters, and we'll probably make a PDF of the presentation available as well. And maybe then the question, Courtney Schultz didn't frame it quite as a question, but maybe it would be worth commenting, Laurie or Dave, about some different types of data, like Courtney mentions excuse me, social science data, and how that might get archived.
Dave, you want to take that one?
Oh, sure. Mostly there's not, it doesn't matter a whole lot what discipline it's coming from, mostly. Just in the sense that mostly this process, you're going to catch my biases here. We tend to look at, Laurie and I both have a background as statisticians, and so we sort of look at data as data, and it doesn't matter whether you're doing physics or biology. Linear regression is linear regression, and and even to the extent of journal articles, we all have this fairly standard structure of introduction, methods, results, discussion. That seems to work for everybody. There are, of course, though, some special aspects with some types of social science research. Qualitative data in and of themselves are not an issue, but certainly data collected from people can be. And we have some capabilities to do that. And whether our capabilities are the best ones to use depends a little bit on what you negotiate in your data management plan with JFSP. We certainly can, if you negotiate these data are very sensitive, they can't get out, we can just stick a data set in the dark archive for 10 years, for 50 years, or we can do like the Library of Congress for the life of the Republic in 1,000 years. I think that's the Library of Congress rule. But another alternative for human subjects data is to use a repository that is aimed at that kind of data. And there's an inter-university consortium on political and social research. I'm remembering the way the acronym expands correctly. That's what they do. And they have their own metadata standard. It's quite complex. I've had some JFSP researchers go off and say they're going to go use that, and then they gave feedback. I looked at that, and that's more pain than I want to do. So they decided to document with the FGDC standard. But they do have, at IPSCR, they have facilities for letting researchers have access to the data without having the data. So at least for some types of human subject data where you don't want to release them because you can get into personally identifiable information, but they can be accessed for research purposes, they've got IT infrastructure that will support that. And that's what they do. Certainly, though, there will be types of human subject data that, quite bluntly, institutional review boards just say, we do not want this stuff being available, period. And that's the sort of thing that if you're thinking that's what you're going to be doing, just get that stuff cleared with JFSP ahead of time. And then, we're not going to be breathing down your neck saying you have to make all these data available when your IRB would kill you if you did, because that's not the point.
Some other things that we can do too, we can take out some of that information. We do have some data that's been submitted to us by Laurie where we just remove those columns of data that would be PII, that would help you determine who maybe made that comment as well. And we do actually have one package, I think, that's got interview results. So we have done some social science data, some that's very simple as well. I think that example, I think it's called Deep Smarts. I think if you search on Deep Smarts in our archive, you would find that one. So there are some ways around, if it's a simpler set of data, that we can still archive that for you.
Yeah, and I happen to be sensitive to the more complex one at the moment because I just had a question last week about that kind of data and had to go off and look at what is IPSCR's URL and provide that to the researcher and say, you can think about there. But what I told that person was the exact same thing I told you. In the end, we're all the science community, and if your IRB says don't release, that's the rule, unless JFSP's board says otherwise. But that's at the archive, that's our rule. If an IRB says don't release, we don't push people to release.
Okay, thanks for delving into that. Another set of questions that I think are slightly linked. John asked about data volumes, talking about a particular project that has data in the tens of terabytes, and maybe somewhat similarly, Chris Bowman asked about archiving Landsat imagery and the ability to just point to the Landsat archive for the raw data versus maybe the processed images. Do you guys want to comment a little bit on large data sets? And I think often these are remote sensing or GIS kind of data sets.
Yes. Right now, we only have the ability to have zip files on our site that are 2 gigabytes in size, roughly, or a little bit smaller, just because of our ability to upload and download. So what we do in cases where we have larger data, like in the terabyte range, what we have the researcher do is select a variety of files from their archive that would make sense. So for instance, if you have images that are taken every 5 minutes over a week's time, they will perhaps choose some at the beginning, some in the middle, and some at the end. And then we'll provide those so that they are available for download for the user. And then if the user is interested in that data, they can contact us and we will work with them to get that data to them. It may be something where they need to send us a drive and we'll put the files on it and send it back. However, this is becoming more and more common now, and we have more people who are wanting to submit terabytes of data to us. So actually, Dave and I just talked last week how we need to start talking about other ways that we can make this data available. So we're going to be looking into that now that that's becoming more of a norm to have these large amounts of data. But we can have many, many different zip files for people to download as well. So, so your data doesn't have to be less than, and this is zipped as well, but your data doesn't have to be less than 2 gigabytes just to submit to us. That's just the limit right now on our zip file download. We also have the ability to put the data into our dynamic database, where basically users can choose what they want to download and download a subset of that as well, which we haven't done with spatial data, but that actually is something else that we could consider. As far as the other question about raw, if the data are already in another archive, that's definitely something where then you guys could just submit the metadata to us, and then we could point to data in that archive as well. We do prefer that people archive the raw form of the data that makes sense to use. You don't want to be archiving data that's not usable to someone, but if you've done a lot of things to it that a user could do on their own, we do want to archive that raw data, just because people can go back to the original form and do whatever they need to with that data. Dave, do you want to add more details to size and Landsat stuff?
No, that's most of it. I mean, and this also came up actually in a question posed last week to me and Laurie over email. Our usual thing on derived or secondary data is there's no reason to republish stuff that other folks have published. The two usual, and our rule is we're not going to make you do it. You know, if it's already published someplace, we're not going to make you do it. No matter how intelligent we may think it is to republish, we're not going to make you do it. The cases where we say, you might think about it, is one, if the data there's somebody else's data, but they're not actually readily available, and you had to go through work to get them. If you can get permission to be the publisher for them, that's great, because that makes it possible for other people to use that resource. And then the one that Laurie mentioned, if you've gone through and done a lot of transformations on a data set, that would be probably possible, but might be painful for somebody else to replicate, and you want to simplify somebody else's work, either just because you're a nice person or because you're hoping to get citations of your data set. That's a reason to republish stuff, just because you've done a significant transformation. The one that's really interesting to me, and again, this is one of these, you know, Laurie and I both have lots of, there is no clear answer. There's lots of perfectly intelligent ways to do things and do them in different ways. There are a lot of data sets floating around out there, publicly available, that the data that are there today that describe the period of, let's say, from January to June of last year, the data that are describing January to June of last year in 5 years may not be the same data. Here in the Forest Service, our own beloved Forest Inventory and Analysis database is like that. More broadly, the U.S. Census Bureau's database is like that, that they just go in and they update their database, and once they've done that, there's no way to get that original data back. So to the extent that it's important from your perspective as the researcher, that somebody be able to use the same data you'd used to either validate a new method or to do some other kind of analysis that's extending your work, to the extent that that's important, then republishing published data can be a useful thing. But we're not going to, and so if you say, I've got a bunch of census data, I want to publish that as part of my set, we're going to say, yeah, okay, fine. But if we're also running through and it's like, oh, the metadata says I grabbed the data from census and I did these things to them, and then I did some analysis later on, and those data, the census data and the things you did to them aren't in the package, we'll probably ask just to make sure that you didn't forget to put them in. But if you say, oh, no, I don't want to have them there, I just want to have the citations to the data sets, we're going to say, hunky-dory, off we go. And that's probably more than you wanted to know.
Great. Well, thanks. I think some of those details are really crucially important. And maybe one of those, Chris Bowman asked about supporting only zip files, or whether you guys will support other compression algorithms.
Yeah, we can support any of that. Typically what happens is people will send us their raw data, or they'll send it to us zipped in any format, which is fine. And then what we do is we will package everything and zip it on our end to make it available to the user. So they can submit it however they like, and then we'll make those modifications at the end. Now, if we do have huge data sets, we do have some cases where people have zipped files within a zip file. And so if they have a format that they prefer for whatever reason, maybe it's some smaller, I'm not sure, I can't think of any reason anything else would be particularly better, but we can definitely make those accommodations. The idea is we want to make it available to users in a format that they can utilize. So as long as it's a zip something compression that we can have them. So in other words, we can't require them to have certain software. So as long as they can decompress it on their end, then that would be fine.
Great, thanks. Other folks out there have questions or comments that they want to get to the presenters? Please type them in. And maybe it seems like the questions have slowed down, so I don't know, Molly, if you want to chime in, but I'd like to thank the presenters. I know I was basically just listening during this webinar, but I certainly learned a lot. And since I've been involved in some of these JFSP research projects, this is a pretty crucial detail. So I appreciate you guys taking the time to step us all through carefully.
Yes, thank you very much, and for just your support overall. I think it's obvious from this webinar that these two are really eager to help people in submitting their data and their metadata. So.
Our pleasure.
Yes, thank you for having us.
Great. Well, maybe with that, we'll close off the webinar. And if you were on our list to join the webinar, you'll get a follow-up email with a link to the recording and other resources. So thank you all very much.